So when leaders are under the effect of power, things change. That empathy dissolves, it goes away. So tell us about how or why or what's going on there.
Yeah, so this is fascinating. This actually, they've done a whole bunch of scientific experiments where they've put people into MRI machines and they've actually measured, they've primed people to either be put in a powerful or a powerless state. And what we found, I didn't do the research personally, I read it, and there's numerous studies that have done this. So what we found is that ultimately is that the more power that people feel, the less empathy they have. It's just, it's like I don't need you. I don't, because I feel powerful. I guess the end result of that is when people feel powerful, like I don't need you. And so so when I don't need you, the next logical step is I don't care about you all that much.
You are listening to The Leadersmith, Darren Gerdes.
Okay, so with me is Allah. I'm not saying it right. It's French. Alain, without the N. How do you say your own name?
It's yeah, sure. My name is Alain Hunkins. Yeah,
right. Okay, so I was trying to do this before we actually got started, and I kept fumbling it. Okay, so he's written a great book. It's called Cracking the Leadership Code, and now I saw the book before and I didn't pick it up because it looked like it was over promising. Cracking leadership code, yeah, like you have the end. No, it actually did give me a number of ahas that I haven't seen in other books. We're going to go over at least 8 of them in this episode of things that were in the book that I was like, wow, that's really interesting. Now, it's to say that I haven't found it in another book. For a sophomore in college, that's not a big thing, right? Like, how many books have you read? I read, as anybody who really listens to this regularly will know, I read a minimum of 100 books a year. I read 200 last year, okay? And so I'm no slouch. I have read a lot. And there are at least 8 different things here that I want to point out that I've not heard framed this way. And some of them are just like an inversion of something that we've otherwise would have been talking about in leadership or management kind of classes. Okay, so we're going to start with the first story, the post office story. So I want you to briefly talk about the post office story and then tell us why you offered that as like the first thing that we talked about. I was intrigued from that moment forward.
Yeah, it's a great story. So I think it's in 2004. Basically, the leaders of the U.S. Post Office, and the way the book starts it off, it doesn't actually reveal that it's the post office, but it is the post office, that they had this big problem. What they found is that their customer expectations were not, what customers expected and what they were delivering were not the same. Customers were not happy. And so what they found out was that the wait times in their retail locations was too long. So they went back and forth and back and forth. And as you can imagine, what ended up happening is they created this 87-page strategic plan that came out of this. And the big takeaway from all this, they made a decision. And the decision that they made to deal with the fact that customers were waiting too long online at the post office was to take all the clocks out of the post offices.
Sure, because
everywhere in the US. Because that'll solve the problem. And so I saw that somewhere. I was like, oh my gosh, this story is so good. And it's so, on the one hand, it's so ridiculous that would happen. On the other hand, I think it's not so far-fetched that people can't relate to that level of inanity just happening. And that's why I wanted to start the book with that, because if you think about it, that didn't just happen. People made that decision, and those people are in leadership roles who make choices that the rest of us have to live with. And to me, anyone who's ever had a lousy boss in their life somewhere can relate to what were they thinking? What were they thinking? And so that was the goal of starting off the book, because what I wanted to show, leadership is so much easier to talk about and write about than it is to do and live. Yeah, and right. So I wanted to bring out, because I think throughout the book, I try to bring a lot of stories and examples of why is this so dang hard? Because if this was easy, we'd have a lot better leaders. But the fact is, and I shared some of the research in the book, only about 23% of people think that leaders are effective, which means that 77%, I'm sure they're waking up and trying to be effective. They mean to be, they have good intentions, but they're not. And so what are the things that get in the way? So that was a great story to kickstart the conversation.
So Matt, the manager that you talked about, had a really good idea as far as dealing with people. He talked about how people don't want him to fix it. They want him to do what?
They want him to lead, right? So
Yeah.
we don't want to be a fixer. Yeah, this is the story of. So Matt is a district manager for a national retail franchise, and Matt ended up becoming the number one top ranked district manager in the company out of 100, but he didn't start that place, right? He started at like 80, 84, 85. And he stuck down there for a long time. And this is his mindset encapsulate. I call it the facilitative mindset. And he got there, but he didn't start there. He started with this idea that, oh, as many people do, they get promoted to these roles, right? He's a good doer. We're going to promote you to district manager. And so now he sees himself as superhero, the fixer. It's that old command and control. Like, I'm in charge. I'm going to tell you what to do. I'm going to fix this, do this. So he'd drive from store to store every day, going through his key performance metrics. They call it the hot list. And he would circle what was in red and say, you got to fix this. You got to fix this. Do this, do that, do this, do this. And nothing changed. In fact, things got worse. And he said the worst day was the day there were people in the stores who were quitting. He didn't even know what their names were. And so he realized he needed to change his approach. And so he shifted from being a fixer to a leader, ultimately going in, and instead of saying, you need to fix this, Darren, like he'd start like, oh, Darren, you're a person. Hey, Darren, how are you? How was your weekend? How's your family? What did you do? Did you watch the basketball game last night? Whatever it is he's talking about. And so he'd start to build some real relationships. And then he still had all the same performance data, but instead of saying, look at this, see what's wrong, you got to fix this, he'd say, hey, Darren, here's the data. What do you think we should do? Right. So that means he trusts that you actually have an opinion and some ideas on how we can fix this. And then together they would co-create solutions together. And what Matt saw is as he started to shift his approach, the performance of all the stores started to improve. And he realized, and I love the way he said this, he said, the key to making the numbers was to stop focusing on the numbers and start focusing on the people.
Because I had that quote down because if you didn't say it, I was going to.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
Yeah.
Right.
Because
it's just like what's his name? Everybody Matters. I'm trying to remember the name of the book or the author, but it's essentially the same thing. When you start realizing, and he phrased it, this is Bob, I can't remember his last name. Bob Chapman said, when I started realizing that everybody is somebody's precious child, everything changed for me. And you said you got the same kind of concept.
Yeah. It's basically, if you stop, you got to realize you start focusing on the people, because ultimately, if you look at any numbers in any business, whether it's quality metrics or revenue or profit, whatever it is, those numbers are a lagging indicator of efforts and behaviors that were done by people. So that's why I say, it doesn't matter if you're in high tech or in pharmaceuticals or in grocery stores, whatever, you're in the people business because everything gets done in and through people. Without people, there is no company. And so we got to not get sucked into this idea that the numbers are bigger than the people. The numbers are just a result of what the people do. So
that's right.
We need to it's not that you're not going to look, I'm not saying that we're going into not-for-profits and not trying to do anything. That's not the point. The point of this is to recognize that ultimately we have to prioritize the people first, because they will then take care of the numbers. And that means a level of trust and also a certain level of letting go of control. Because the thing is, numbers are neat and tidy. I mean, let's face it, Darren, every single day you show up to a meeting, 7 is always one more than 6 and 1 less than 8. No one ever argues. It never complains. It's, every day a person might be in a different mood. They might be, focused. Well, some days we're more productive. Some days we're kind of laggy. It's just, we're a lot more complicated and messy than numbers are. So you look at how many people who end up in CEO roles used to be CFOs, right? It's like, because we need someone to control and manage this stuff. And it's like, that is just one piece of a much larger whole. It's an important piece, but it's not everything. So we have to recalibrate for how to lead in today's world.
So it's like I gave you my script, which I did not.
No, you didn't.
I wrote out, I have pages of yellow, great.
Awesome.
Okay. And in here, you anticipated the very next thing, trust. Now, I tell my students that, if you give trust, you get trust. And you talked about how trust gets results, but the phrase preceding that, you talked about what earns trust. Now, I've talked for years about how trust leads to trust gets results, that kind of thing. But I hadn't thought about the part beforehand. What builds trust?
Were we talking about empathy? Are we talking about
empathy? That's exactly right.
Yeah.
You said empathy builds trust. Trust gets results. That's right. I don't know why I never connected. This is part 2, or number 2 of my 8. I don't know why I haven't thought about that, but that's right. Empathy, the degree that you have empathy leads to trust. Trust gets you the results that you're after. Yeah, it's staring me right in the face, but it's like I never connected the mental dot.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, it's very easy for us to hang out with these concepts and have them be in isolation, but it's like, how do they ultimately interconnect? And this is the beauty of learning from each other as a community of, educators, thought leaders, writers, et cetera. It's like, oh, I hadn't, that's why I keep reading. That's why you keep reading. Because I want to think about these ideas, which I've been milling on for digesting for years and years. I want to think about them in a new way. But ultimately, yeah, if we look at how does empathy build trust? And my easy, simple definition of empathy is showing people that you understand them and care how they feel. Because let's face it, like as humans, we are hardwired to connect to other people. I mean, this is why when a baby cries, that a parent rushes. I mean, because we're like, oh, what's that crying noise? I don't know. What do you think? Like the baby would die or whatever. So we're hardwired to respond. So emotions are contagious. And so showing people that you understand them makes them feel that they belong. We've talked a lot about in the world of DE&I. The goal of DE&I is ultimately belonging, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion is like we want that feeling of belonging. And in ancient times, they talk about the Greeks and the Romans. The worst thing that could happen is you would be exiled, you would be banished. You no longer belong to the community, to the tribe. And so the sense of belong. So what empathy does is like, yeah, they get me. They understand me. I belong here. And what that does is it creates psychological safety. It lets our guard down. And it means that we now can open up and we can trust. And, I'm sure you've probably read Stephen M.R. Covey's book, The Speed of Trust. And the big takeaway from that to me is that the great thing of when you have, because people think, oh, trust, isn't that a nice thing? Isn't that a soft thing? Isn't that a fuzzy, warm, wonderful thing? Do we really need that? The fact is, when we have high trust, we have high speed, right? So, because when you have trust, you don't worry about all these things. And when you have low trust, or as Stephen M.R. Covey calls it, you pay a low trust. When you have low trust, you pay a low trust tax versus earning a high trust dividend. So things slow down. I mean, and don't take my word for it. Everyone listening, think of an example where, let's say you didn't trust someone a whole lot and you had to write them an email. Have you had the experience of, first of all, you're crafting every word? How is this going to sound? How is this going to, I don't know. And I say, hey, Darren, can you read this before I send it? Because, I don't trust that it's going to come across the way I want it to. So think of all of that time and energy and focus and kind of worry that goes into relationships where there's low empathy, low trust, and low connection.
Yeah, reorganization. If you don't know what to do, they reorganize, right? And I know that what the literature says about reorganization, and it doesn't work. But when I actually experienced it, and then I found myself thinking, like, I've wasted at least a third of my time trying to figure out what's going to happen on the other side of this reorganization. Hey, what a train wreck. Okay, so let's move on from there. From empathy builds trust, and trust gets results. So when leaders are under the effect of power, things change. That empathy dissolves, it goes away. So tell us about how or why or what's going on there.
Yeah, so this is fascinating. And they've done a whole bunch of scientific experiments where they've put people into MRI machines and they've primed people to either be put in a powerful or a powerless state. And what we found, I didn't do the research personally, I read it, and there's numerous studies that have done this. So what we found is that ultimately the more power that people feel, the less empathy they have. It's just, it's like I don't need you. Because I feel powerful. I guess the end result of that is when people feel powerful, like, I don't need you. And so so when I don't need you, the next logical step is I don't care about you all that much. And also I don't have time for you and your problems and your issues. Another fancy way for saying just shut up and do your job, right? Think about that. That's the kind of power play that goes on. And if you look kind of historically, and I write about this in the book too, kind of the age of the Industrial Revolution, very much workers. I mean, this is where the term human resources came from. In fact, I was just talking with a client yesterday, and he works for a large technology company that's based in Germany, and how they've rebranded their human resources function as the people function, because they're trying to get away from the old industrial age mechanistic mindset that people are just a bunch of spare part resources that, oh, this one doesn't work, we're going to swap out this. It's like I got this 7/16 wrench, I'm going to swap that one out and put another one in. And so the whole idea here is that we as leaders have to understand that as we get elevated and have more authority and power in organizations, the tendency is that we're more likely to be less empathetic with people. And the research would show this. So it turns out, this was a study from Business Solver a couple of years ago, is that they asked CEOs and organizations, as well as the employees, are your organizations empathetic? Well, 92% of the CEOs said, yes, our organizations are empathetic. They get it. They're like, oh, people are important. They put up on a big plaque, people are our greatest resource or our greatest, you've seen things like this. And then they asked all the employees, do you think that your CEOs are empathetic? Well, it turns out only 50% of the employees thought that their CEOs demonstrated empathy. So we might think that we're being connected, kind, trustworthy, but are we really doing so? And this is another area that I think is so important for anyone who is interested in leadership. And some of you might be familiar with this concept, but it's worth repeating. Psychologists call it the fundamental attribution error, which basically means that we judge ourselves by our intentions, but we judge other people by their actions, right? So I'm a good person. Like, for example, you're driving along and someone cuts you off in traffic. Your first thought is, oh, what a jerk, fill in the blank, bleep, 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 right? So you might think that about they cut you off in traffic. Well, when you cut people off in traffic, probably not even thinking that you do, like, oh, I'm in a rush, I have to go, right? So we judge ourselves. You don't understand, I'm late to this meeting or something. We tell it to ourselves a very different story. However, recognize that leadership is a relationship of managing intentions and perceptions, and that ultimately, what at its core of leadership is, it is a relationship between a leader and someone who chooses to follow. And the person who has the final say of the quality of that relationship and how effective it is isn't the leader. It's the person who chooses to follow. So we have to get out of our own head and our own power and our own ego and really understand, how are people seeing me as their leader? And it's almost like you take the traditional pyramid org chart, right, with a leader on top, and flip it. Instead of thinking, and this is what Robert Greenleaf in his famous book, Servant Leadership, talks about, is this idea of how can you be of service? Because if you can be of service to the people that you lead, they will do better. They will get better results. And guess what? If you're leading them and your results are contingent on their results, if they do better, you do better. But that is a flip of the mindset for so many people that are used to wanting to ascend to the top of the pyramid. And now, like Matt, I'm the fixer, I'm in charge. So we have to flip the mindset, and then the behaviors will start to follow.
Right. And you said that there was an inverse correlation, and I'm quoting, an inverse correlation between power and empathy for others. And then you talked about Jeff's story where he said, welcome to leadership. As a leader, you'll always be a target. And you said whether it's good or bad. Can you unpack some of that?
Sure. Yeah. So I share this story. I've shared this numerous times. It's a great story. So I met my mentor named Jeff. We met for lunch. We used to meet for lunch every month or so in New York when I was living there. This is 20 years ago, even more. We would talk shop about leadership. So we're finishing up lunch and he hands me this gift bag and he says, congratulations. I just finished this training. I had spent years preparing for it to get certified to lead a very complicated training. It took years. So this was his thank you, like his congratulations gift. So I open up this gift bag and inside is this t-shirt that says leader on the front. I was like, thanks, Jeff. That's really sweet. I really felt seen and acknowledged because like Jeff was a father figure to me. So this was a really nice, sweet moment. And then Jeff, because he's infinitely wise, he has this bald head and he's like got the fluorescent light is shining on top of his head. He gets this impish grin on his face. He says, oh, no, turn the shirt around. So it says leader on the front. On the back is a large archery target. Right? That's what's on the back, right? And then he says to me, welcome to leadership. Because as a leader, you're always a target. Now, if you're a great leader, you will be the target of people's hopes, of their dreams, of their aspiration. You might even be the target of their envy. But if you're a lousy leader, you're going to be the target of people's disappointment, their criticism, and their blame. No matter what, you are always a target. You cannot not be a target. Now, what type of target are you going to be? That is for you to understand. And what Jeff was getting at and understood intuitively with his t-shirt analogy, all the research bears this out. I'm sure, Darren, you're familiar with the work that Gallup has done around, ultimately the number one factor that makes for more successful employees, whether you measure success by productivity, engagement, lower levels of retention, has nothing to do with the company you work for. It all, has nothing to do with your salary, has nothing to do with your benefits. It all has to do with what is your relationship with your immediate supervisor. And that's where the phrase people don't leave companies, they leave bosses came from.
Yep.
So that's kind of made the common language now around that. But yeah, so ultimately, you as the leader, you create the culture that people will either thrive in or just flounder in. And the thing when it comes to culture is every leader, just like you're a target, every single leader creates a culture. Now, what great leaders do is they create culture by design. Lousy leaders create culture by default because they don't think they're doing it all unconsciously, unintentionally. They're like, hey, this is how I do stuff. I haven't thought about why. And particularly, I haven't thought about the impact that what I do has on other people. I'll give you an example of that. And many people can be familiar with this. So lots of leaders I know now, people are working remotely, virtually. And so lots of leaders are like, hey, with my kids and stuff at home, my peak time to work is actually after the kids go to bed. And I send out emails between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. Okay. And they're like, that's what I do. Well, that's great that you want to, and I get you want to work when it's most productive for you. However, if you're sending me, if I'm your direct report and you send me an email at 11:30 at night and I'm up and I get that, I am now in a quandary. And you could say, well, I don't expect you to answer it. Well, the thing is, you have now just put some psychological baggage on me because unless we've really talked about this in advance, what is happening now is like, well, I either respond or I don't respond, but I'm thinking about it. And this is time I'm supposed to be off work, renewing, recharging. So when I show up the next day, I'm productive. So part of me is like, well, I should respond now because I want to be seen as a good, loyal, dutiful employee. Or God, if I don't respond right now, how am I going to you see how you've just created all this mental chatter in my head? Whereas if you basically put that, or you can schedule your emails to go out at whatever 8 a.m., 9 a.m. the next day, or you can put it in your draft folder. And then when you get up the next day, you can send it out. And also having some really clear conversations with your employees about this, that is leading by design. I'm just going to send it whenever I want. That is leading by default. So it's a very, very important distinction.
A little empathy could have told you, like, don't do that. Right?
Yeah.
And so part 3 of my third aha was the target. And we know the bad side of the target, but the good side of the target, and that you're always a target, even of their hopes and dreams and aspirations. Now, point 4 that I had here was that people lower in the hierarchy watch higher ups far more closely than people above look down. Right. And you said that, and that's almost a direct quote. And you gave the example of baboons. Like, it even works there. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So this was a great study that came out of a bunch of scientists studying baboons and watching. So baboons live in something they call a troop. And this has also been shown with chimpanzees as well, but we'll just stay with baboons for now. So the idea is that they live in a troop, and within the troop, there is the alpha, right? So the alpha is oftentimes a male, but it's kind of considered the leader. Everyone's familiar with the idea of an alpha in any kind of group or gang or organization. So the way it works with the baboons is that all of the the baboons, they're not people, they're folks. All the baboons who are lower on the hierarchy, on the totem pole, as it were, they are looking at the alpha. I think I don't have the exact. I want to say it's like 150 times every call, like very often. They're constantly checking in because, am I okay? What are they doing? Because they're looking for signals that might mean something. Am I still safe? What do they think about? They're looking at them constantly. And then they watched and they measured how often the alpha would look at the other baboons. And it's very infrequently because they're like, I'm the alpha. What do I need to look at that? So it's the sense that, so the analogy, the takeaway for the rest of us on this is that when you are a leader, you are being watched all the time. And you may not think you're being watched, but you are being watched. I share a story in the book about a leader named Pablo, and they were doing something inside of a glass office in their building so everyone could see. And they were trying to do some kind of, and at some point he just threw his hands up and put his head down on the table. And people read into what that meant. And the next day people were going, well, when are the layoffs going to start? Like, what layoffs? People sort of assumed something wasn't going to be happening, this merger. There was a completely going off. And because again, people are wired for negativity. And so we have to realize that in the absence of specific information from us, if we leave a vacuum, and this is very true, especially when you're leading people through change, you say there's going to be, like you said before, Darren, a reorg. First thought is, I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to be fine. And that's what we think. And then we talk to other people and we're all in this negativity. So this gossip mill grows and gets worse and worse. we have to nip that stuff in the bud. We have to recognize that people are going to assume negative intent versus positive. I mean, another horrific example that comes up way too often. How many of us had the experience where you're working with someone, could be your boss, for example, and they just quickly text you, hey, call me, we need to talk. Like, where do you go with that one? Like, I hate that. I hate getting that message because, like, what did I do? Like, the first thought is like, they found something out. I didn't like, and I didn't do anything wrong. Like, I don't know. It's like the same reason why when you're on the highway and the cop, turns on their lights and you're not even speeding, but your heart starts to race. Like, what did I do wrong? Because we have to manage our own. We have to manage this stuff. And so, in the absence of really clear, focused leadership, people get all bent out of shape. And that obviously, when they're bent out of shape, they can't be performing at their best. They are not focused. They are distracted. And so we have to help people to manage their attention. It's one of the most precious resources we have, is how do you help people to manage their attention and focus so they can get done what they need to get done.
Now, you talked about communication a little bit, and that's the next one. This is number 5 for me. You talked about horseshoes, and the way that you put it made so much sense. And I was thinking, like, yeah, I've experienced exactly that. Do you remember the 3? What you mean?
I do. Yeah, I remember this. Yeah, thanks. No, you're setting me up really well here, Darren. And thanks for digging into the book. So,
man, the book was great. I mean,
yeah.
Honestly, I would not say that if it wasn't. It was fantastic.
Thanks. Thanks. Yeah. So I use this analogy. So many people are familiar with the game of horseshoes. Like, you basically have to throw the horseshoe around the stake. And when you do that, it's called a ringer. It is really hard to do. I mean, obviously, professional horseshoe throwers can throw pretty well. For the rest of us, it's really hard to get one ringer. Well, imagine for a moment, if you think about effective communication, doesn't just need one ringer. It needs 3 rings all on top of each other. And the 3 rings are, let's say it's Darren and I. It's what does Darren say is one ring, right? And so is he actually saying what he's saying, right? So there's what he's saying. And then what does Darren mean is the second ring. And the third ring is, what am I hearing on the receiving end of this communication of what he says and means? Do I hear what he says? And what does he say, what he means? And do I hear what he means? Or am I mishearing what he... So there's so many opportunities there for a couple of problems. One is misunderstanding. Misunderstanding is, like a simple example is, wait, you said 18? I thought you said 80. Oh gosh, I'm sorry, because I just ordered 80 of these things and you wanted 18? Oh, I guess we got, 62 extras. Sorry, that's a misunderstanding. And that one's a kind of an easy fix because it'll play out in the wash like, oh, well, you thought 1880. So that's misunderstanding. The other one is way more insidious. This is missed understanding. So let's say I asked Darren, hey, Darren, we're going to be talking to this new customer. What do you think? Any other ideas that we should do? Now, maybe because of our history, Darren doesn't feel safe speaking up. So Darren's like, no, nothing else. So he said, no, nothing else. I hear that. I assume, he's got no other ideas. Right. But in fact, Darren does have other ideas, but he's just not sharing them. That is missed understanding because, and this goes back to the valuing and connection and empathy piece, because we have low trust. This is now going to impact our communication. So there's a lot of pieces that can get in the way of creating shared and mutual understanding. And one of the things that when I'm coaching and training and teaching people on this stuff, I suggest to everyone is that we have to assume that misunderstanding is the default setting of human communication. Don't assume that what you say is being heard. Assume that what you say is being misinterpreted. And so what are all the things that you can do to ensure, and there's all sorts of, and I go through 6 or 7 different ways in which you can make sure that what you're saying and what is being heard and what is being meant is all aligned. And the reason that's also important, this shared understanding is so important, is because this shared understanding becomes the foundation on which everyone's going to make decisions and take action. Yeah. And what you want people to do is take great action, make good decisions to get great results. And again, if I hear 18 and you said 80, guess what? I'm going to make a bad decision and we're going to end up paying an extra whatever for it. So this is why shared understanding is so important. And we need to be vigilant about working at this as leaders.
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure I know why he didn't speak up. He didn't speak up because you, the manager, wanted to do it fast by saying, like, let's just do it my way. Let's get it done, and overrode in the past. There's a military expression, something to the effect of fast is slow, slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. I might have that somewhat jumbled, but if you take the time to slow down and listen to what they have to say and hear the feedback, you get a very different thing. And when you do, and you can interact, then you get ownership. Now, we've talked about ownership a lot in class, but the flip side I haven't talked about, and this was aha number like 6 or 7. I don't remember which one it is, but this was the next aha, because we talk about ownership all the time. And you gave the example of renting as the opposite. And I never thought about, that's right, if you don't get the psychological ownership, here's where you default, and you take that from here.
Sure. Yeah. So we talk about ownership. In fact, we talk about ownership as being one of the kind of 4 human needs that this is around collaboration. There's a whole section of the book around collaboration where we talk about the 4 human needs that people have. People have a need for safety. They have a need for energy. They have a need for purpose, and they have a need for ownership. So this idea of ownership is when people feel they truly own something, they bring more of themselves for it. And the converse, as Darren, as you're alluding to here, is that if you don't have that psychological ownership, what you default to is being a renter. And I give a couple of different examples around this, and one is the fact is, if you've ever rented a car, which I've done many times, I travel all over, is, again, I'll be a little true confession here, but oftentimes I don't treat the rental car the way I would treat my own car. So for example, oftentimes when you go back to the airport, there are speed bumps. We all know there's speed bumps at the airport. And I've been known to drive my rental car a little faster over those speed bumps than I would definitely drive my own car over, because if there's a little ding or damage or, gets a little out of alignment, at the end of the day, it's not my problem. It's somebody else is going to have to fix it. That's going to go downstream, down the road. Someone else will have to deal with that. So just think about the implications of if people have a renter mentality, that basically what they're looking to do is get stuff off their back, check it off their list, pass it downstream. And again, you see this a lot more in large organizations where there are a lot of other people where you can go, well, I was fine when I was here. I passed it along. And then and if you've had the customer experience, I mean, many of us have had this, right? Where let's say you talk to one person like, what? Oh, that's not our department. Hold on. And then you have and you get put on hold. And then, I know I do this with whether it's dealing with all sorts of organizations where I'm a customer where, oh my gosh, I'm on hold again and again. And by the time I talk to someone like, can I help you? It's like, well, first of all, I've been on hold for 49 minutes already, things like that. So there's no sense of ownership of understanding. Again, going back to perception, I am having an experience here. And right now my experience is really lousy. So part of ownership is, I got this. I'm going to see this from end to end because I know what the impact is going to be. And people need to understand part of ownership and the psychological mindset of ownership has to do with, I have to know how what I'm doing fits into the bigger picture, which is why it's so incumbent on leaders to not just tell people what to do or even to guide them on how to do, but step back and go, why? Start with, as Simon Sinek famously said, right? Start with why. Why are we doing this? How does this fit into our larger, bigger picture of the organization? How does this fit into the larger, bigger picture of how we are making something valuable in society? People want to know that. They want to feel that, because when people have that, that starts to lead into that sense of meaning and purpose and how important. When people feel that what they do really matters, they bring so much more of themselves and so much more energy and focus to it. So there are things that as leaders we can do through our language to communicate these things that create a very different environment where people can start to thrive at.
When I was starting out as a professor, I was a terrible professor in this regard. I would give, here's the team project, right? And I'd give them 3 pages of detailed instructions of what they had to do. And if they just checked all these boxes, it would be great. And it was terrible. It was always terrible. I'm like, why is it always terrible? Because they were renting. They didn't own it. I owned it. They didn't. And so they would turn in, they would check the boxes dutifully, and it was terrible. Now, I've flipped that and I went exactly the other direction. Here's a big picture of what you're going to do. And I gave them very limited amounts of information other than what the deliverable should look like briefly. And they would be like, you got to tell us more than that. Nope, figure it out. Then now they didn't like having to figure it out, but as they figured it out, they took ownership over it. They were no longer renting it because they were no longer renting. They were really proud of what they did.
Yeah. And
so I've experienced that firsthand. Okay. Last major concept, I think this is the 8th one now, is email. And I never thought about this before, but you were talking about limiting CCing. And I was like, duh, what have I been doing to myself? Go ahead, tell us about it.
Well, yeah, we talk a lot about, there's these three major themes in the book that go through. The subtitle of the book is Three Secrets to Building Strong Leaders. And we've touched on many of them already here today. The first one is connection, under which empathy falls. The second one has to do with communication. So all that stuff we talk about with the horseshoes and misunderstanding falls under communication. And then the third is collaboration, under which ownership. So everyone hears this, they get great connection, communication, collaboration, but I am swimming. My day is so busy. How do I do this? And the two major time sucks for most of us are meetings and emails. And so it turns out there's a lot of things, email is a relatively new invention. I mean, I'm old enough, and you might be too, Darren, where remember there was a life, call it, BE, before email, and things were a bit different then. But so one of the challenges with any kind of technology, and I often coach leaders, and I say this sentence at least once a week, when it comes to technology, just because you can doesn't mean you should. I'll say that again, right? Just because you can doesn't mean you should. So for example, there's a wonderful feature on email. You can carbon copy, CC people on emails. Now, that's great in certain situations. However, in a lot of organizations, I say that we should change the features function. So instead of saying CC, it should say CYA, right? Because it stands for cover your ass, in the sense that, so many people feel like, oh, I'm going to just copy everyone on this because I want to leave a paper trail. Like, who wants to read someone's paper trail that's not really relevant to you? The fact is, every single time you see someone on that is yet another area that they now have to focus on. Oh, this new thing came in my inbox. And then they have to go through and filter. Is this important? Is this not important? And if we could all agree, let's trust each other a little more, that we don't need to have a completely documented paper trail for everything. Now, look, I get the fact that depending on what you're doing, there may be places where you want a paper trail, but it might be more infrequent than you think. So starting to limit the who's being copied on that. I mean, another example within email that I share a lot is just, this goes back to understanding clarity of subject line. I mean, how many times have you gone back and forth, and that what you're actually talking about by the fifth, sixth, seventh email has absolutely nothing to do with the subject line? And if that wasn't bad enough, how many of you have then gotten circled in? It's already been like the sixth, the seventh, the email, eighth email has gone on. At this point, the subject line has nothing to do with anything. And someone now is forwarding this to you. And then what they write is like, FYI, see below. FYI, see below. Right. And now you have to go, what I call it, subject fishing. What the heck am I doing now? And it takes you a good amount of, we all go, oh, I hate when people do that to me. I mean, I've asked many, many groups. How many of you have ever experienced this? Like, oh, I hate it. I hate it when people do this to me. No one likes that. No one likes to have to do that. Say, great, put your hand down. Now put your hand back up. Do you do that to anybody else? And people are like, yeah, I guess I do. And why do we do that? Because in the moment, we're being renters. In the moment, we're like, not my problem. And we pass the buck downstream, and now someone else has got to go clean it off. Instead of, if I just took a couple of moments, right? It's more time on my end, but how it's going to help other people out so much more. But we have to be thinking it's not just about me. And I think as a rule of thumb, as a leader, a good thing to consider is leadership is not about you. Leadership is about the people that you lead. And so whenever you're making a decision, stop and think, am I doing this for me? Am I doing this for the people that I lead? And that will.
So I'm laughing because that's rule one in my introductory fundamentals to leadership class. Leadership's not about you. It's about your people. And that's right. So we're very much on the same page, but you brought out some nuances that I was like, wow, that I hadn't framed it this way before. I haven't thought about it this way before. By the way, if you have not read the book, I would highly recommend that you get a hold of this book, read the book. Right now, it's got 117 ratings on Amazon. Of course, that'll change over time. 4.8 out of 5 stars. That is unusual to be that good of a book, which is why I was like, maybe I'll read it. It looks like, it has some kind of social proof that it was some, and it was. It more than met my expectations. It exceeded it, it's kind of rare to find this many different nuggets. And we didn't even talk about a number of other stories in here, whether it was the car situation that could have been avoided, or just whatever. I mean, there's a number of items in here that I would have liked to cover, but just for the sake of time, we couldn't. So I'm going to say thank you for coming. And I always leave with a quotation for contemplation, but I want to take one from your book, which is unusual. I usually take it from some other source, and that is Matt the Manager. right? I mean, the key to making the numbers is to stop focusing on the numbers, focus on the people. And if you just get that, a lot will go better for you as a leader. And I'm going to give you the last word if there's anything else that you want to say to leave our audience with.
Yeah. Hey, Darren, thank you, first of all, so much for this. And yeah, I hope folks, you recognize that leadership is a journey. This book was written, not just me sitting down at a typewriter. I have been working with literally thousands and thousands of groups over 20 years. So the idea was, if I was to hand someone a roadmap to help accelerate their leadership learning curve and to be able to help them to grow, this is what I would have written. And I'm super proud of it. So I do hope you check it out. If you want to check out the other things that I do, please go to www.alainhunkins, that's ALAINHUNKINS.com. It has a whole bunch of resources there for you too. And feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn as well.
Thank you so much for taking the time to visit with us today.
My pleasure, Darren. Thank you.